Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, trade unions and social democratic parties across the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week's episode, we are joined by Anatole Jenkins, who has quite an impressive career and CV for such a young person and such a young organiser in democratic politics. But most recently, he was the national director for the state's Organising for the Biden presidential campaign. And he's currently a fellow at Georgetown University. And he's on the podcast today to really talk about his experience as an organiser dating back to 2007 when he first got involved in the Obama primary campaign against Hillary Clinton and the token white guy, John Edwards, and all the way through to the successful election of the Biden-Harris ticket not that long ago. So that's today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast via your favorite podcast app. And if you're using Apple Podcasts, can you give us a review and leave us a 5-star rating or 4.5? I'll let you do 4.5, but 5 would be better. And don't forget also, you can follow all the updates for the podcast on the Dunn Street socials, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Now, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a glorious Wednesday morning in Melbourne, and joining me on the line from Washington, D.C., where it is less glorious and probably a little bit more snowy, is the 2020 National Director for the state's Organising for the Biden-Harris presidential campaign and a current fellow at Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service. Anatole Jenkins, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am very, very excited to be here, and hello to all of our Aussie friends.
I was going to tell you something before we went on air, and I thought, no, I'm going to save this little nugget for our listeners, which some of my listeners who were on this 2008 Aussies for Obama trip will recall this story. But just when you told me about your going back to university at Georgetown, the last time I was in Georgetown was in 2008. And it was the night that the Phillies won the World Series, and we got absolutely wasted in a bar in Georgetown and then went to some sort of nightclub that there was no one in it, but there was a DJ playing incredibly loud music to nobody on the dance floor except for us drinking at a bar. And then proceeded to walk back to our hotel, and we're so drunk that we ripped down all of the Ralph Nader sort of bunting posters that were on all of the lampposts all the way back to our hotel. Now, we don't remember doing that because we were so shit-faced. However, the next morning when we drove out of DC to go to the next campaign spot, we're driving along that main street of Georgetown, seeing all of these Ralph Nader posters on the ground going, I think that might have been us last night.
Yes. I wonder if the bar that you guys were at was the Tombs, which is if we have any Georgetown listeners, they'll know that is a famous hangout spot in Georgetown that I unfortunately will not get the chance to enjoy over the semester while I'm spending time there because of the pandemic. But hopefully I'll get there soon. So, but tons of great spots in Georgetown, and that's how you celebrate in DC.
Evidently. Anyway, we didn't get arrested, thank God. Right, but we're not here to talk about my past exploits in across the US. We're here to talk about you. Now, you've got an incredibly good CV, and what I wanted to do today was really to sort of go back and get a sense of how you first got involved in politics, all the way up until your involvement in the most recent general election for the very, very successful Biden-Harris campaign. But let's start with, first of all, how you got involved in politics. What led you to become politically active and set you on your journey to be an organizer?
Yeah, well, for me, it was the 2007 Democratic primary, which it's so funny because I say that now and it makes me feel incredibly old, even though I am young. Just 'cause so many of the younger organizers who are getting involved in politics now have no memory of it. But the 2007 Democratic primary, I think that, or I know that rather, I always wanted to do work that was part of something bigger than myself. In high school, I wanted to be an architect to build beautiful, sustainable buildings for the world. But 2007 Democratic primary happened my senior year, and a couple things happened to me. One, I fell in love with Barack Obama, much like so many other young people back then, and the whole world really, right? And you hear a lot about people who talk about, that before 2007, before 2008, they didn't think a Black man would ever be president or could ever be president of the United States. Notice that it was always, I don't think a Black man could be president. It was never, I don't think a Black woman could be. It was just always Black. No one even thought to even think about a Black woman. Well, I would be lying if I said that I thought that. Similar to the rest of the world in terms of the question regarding a Black woman, I never even thought to ask or even question whether or not a Black man could be president. It was something that just never came into my process of being, because I'd never seen that happen before. And so I fell in love with Barack Obama. That was sort of the first thing. Second was I just was completely mesmerized by the Democratic primary in general. A Black man and a woman battling it out for the nomination. And I always say how lucky I was, and many other young people back then were, to become politically aware in 2007. Because what I saw starting out in politics was a Black man and a woman really leading the charge, and two incredibly qualified people who even then after that bitter primary went on and worked together, which, man, what a testament to unity in politics today that we all can learn from. And so I decided that, I wanted to pursue this as a career. I didn't necessarily know what this was at the time, but I knew that I wanted to find out, and I was determined to find out. And so I subsequently, went to college and eventually landed an internship with Barack Obama's political organization. And, from there it was kind of a wrap. So, ultimately saying, that's a long way of saying that representation was what really led me here. Seeing myself in my country's politics and, seeing, more than just old white men.
It's such a historic moment in US politics and democratic politics, as you said, to have a Black man and a woman running for the top of the ticket. And the momentum that would have brought in so many different people from all walks of life in the United States because of those two campaigns, and also then the ability to unify. What led you to then want to become an organizer? Because there are so many different ways in which you can get involved in politics, right? And there's so many different ways you can contribute to the democratic process. Why did you choose organizing?
Great question. The beauty is that someone told me. Someone told me that is the best thing that you can do to help get Barack Obama reelected. So, after I had decided that politics was what I wanted to do, and I spent, couple 2 years organizing or interning for President Obama's political organization. We came to this point in time where that organization was transitioning to become the president's reelection campaign. I was incredibly lucky to as an intern, play a small role in getting those efforts up and running. But I had an incredible boss and mentor at the time who I sat down with, and I said, I want to do whatever I could to make sure that Barack Obama got reelected. And he gave me the best piece of advice that any political, future political practitioners hopefully are listening to. He said, you can either take the sexy job, which is come to Chicago with me, which is where the campaign was headquartered, and be my assistant or be some senior staffer's assistant. Super sexy, what everyone imagines is a campaign. Or you can go to Las Vegas, Nevada, and become an organizer and learn true leadership skills and be there with folks who will truly allow for you to develop into the leader that I know you can be. And so that, led me to going to Nevada and becoming an organizer. I got to Nevada on the Obama campaign, truly in terms of that journey, because someone believed in me and gave me a chance. Was I the most qualified person to be an organizer? No, I was also the first organizer hired on that re-election campaign. Still in college, had never organized before. Probably didn't even know what organizing was. But I was dedicated. I had done a great job as an intern and impressed someone, and they gave me a shot. And, that's one of the most memorable aspects actually of the Obama campaign for me, was that, people were given the opportunity to sort of rise to the occasion a lot, as opposed to bending over backwards to prove themselves first, which I think certainly ushered in a lot of open doors for a lot of young people.
In that Nevada campaign, can you think of a moment when, because you said I didn't really know what organising was when I went into it, but can you think of a moment or certain moments on that campaign when organising clicked for you? You went, I get this now.
Oh man, that's such a good question. That is such a good question. I got on the ground in Nevada really, really early. It was spring of 2011. Again, as I mentioned, I was the first organizer hired, and we kind of just spent about a year just without an opponent, just kind of testing things out, figuring things out, which was a huge luxury for me to have as a new organizer, because it allowed for me to just develop and learn a lot and mess up and fail a lot, which are, some of the biggest lessons that you learn as an organizer are the lessons you learn when you fail. But when I ultimately think about sort of the things that clicked for me in terms of being an organizer, I'll actually mention, I think this one experience, which probably won't sound so much like it's that clicked for you in terms of what it means to be an organizer, but as I continue to just go about the story, it'll make sense. So one of my first volunteer leaders that I ever had, her name is Thelma Hall. She was a volunteer leader. One of the beauties of being an organizer, especially a young organizer, is you ultimately, will have the responsibility of managing people who are like 3 times your age, right? And because that's the average age of a volunteer. And Thelma Hall was my first volunteer. I've talked to her all the time still. She's very, very close to my heart. And in 2011, I was 20 years old as an organizer, managing this, 70-year-old woman. And I thought that, I knew all about how to push her to hit goals, how to motivate her to actually get things done, and how to do that truly for an entire team. I thought that I just knew exactly how to do that. And I think probably it was maybe about 2 months into my relationship of working with Thelma, during one of sort of our one-on-one check-ins or check-in meetings that we had. And she told me, she said, Anatole, when you first got here, and after about a week of working with you, you were just like a chicken with his head cut off. You were just running around here, had no idea what you're doing. And I got all of your team of volunteers together, our neighborhood team together. And I said, hey guys, we have to hit our goals that Anatole sets for us so that he's successful and he doesn't get fired. And that seems like it's not that is what it means to be an organizer. But it truly is. It is, you as an organizer, in every way, you are constantly looking to duplicate yourself, one. So you're constantly looking to duplicate yourself, folks who can do exactly what you can do. You're constantly looking to, quite frankly, organize yourself out of as many jobs as possible so that you can then focus on bigger and other things. And 3, you are building relationships so that people actually continue to come back and are invested in the campaign ultimately. But the truth is, people will come in the door for the campaign and the candidate. They will come back for the relationships that you build with them and that they build with you. And so that clicked for me in terms of what it means to truly be an organizer, and that, it is not all about me. One, my success is not mine. 2, the relationships that I had been building over time paid off and continued to pay off, because I had a group of folks who, whether times were bad, whether, who knows what situation would happen, whether, our candidate said the wrong thing on, a debate stage. It's a group of people who, no matter what, were still going to do the work because they believed in Anatole Jenkins and wanted me to be successful. And, that's an important lesson, I think, for any organizer to know.
There will be a number of Victorian organisers based in my home state here in the great state of Victoria that will be nodding along furiously with that last response you just gave there, Anatole, because it's one of the secret sources, certainly of the Victorian Labour organising model. And we tell them this on day one in terms of, we go through a section, we talk the rules of the road of being an organiser. And one of them is people come for the party or the candidate, but they stay for the organiser. We don't tell the candidates that because they've got egos and we don't want to shatter them.
Yeah.
But it's true. It is just so true. It's the relationships that the organiser builds with their volunteers that brings them back week after week, and also the relationships that the volunteers build with amongst themselves as well in that team model as well. It's so crucial to build that capacity.
That arguably, possibly at certain points in the campaign are more important. So
yeah,
certainly for the long-standing sustainability of the work that you put in.
Yeah. Now, you went on to, you returned to Nevada for the Clinton campaign 4 years later. And I'm just keen to get a sense of, it's almost like a compare and contrast between your experiences working on the Obama campaign in 2012 and then coming back 4 years later for both the primary. That's right, you were working on the Clinton campaign for the primary in Nevada.
I was there in the primary for Nevada.
Yeah, what was your experiences like in that campaign? Because obviously a competitive primary would be a different kind of ball game, right, compared to a general.
Yeah, it was an entirely different ball game. I think that people at the time and even now, looking back at the primary, think that Hillary Clinton, started out with the Clinton machine, which is like famous, right? But truly, we started that campaign in Nevada at an Einstein Bagel in Las Vegas, just kind of strategizing and figuring it out, and had our first volunteer who volunteered for that campaign. She volunteered because an organizer just tweeted that, hey, we're out here organizing for Hillary Clinton, and she responded to it. I led for our campaign in Nevada our efforts in East Las Vegas, which is arguably one of the hardest places to organize in the United States because of its transient nature and a whole host of other aspects. But it's such a vibrant, such a beautiful, largely Latino community. And our approach there was one. It was important to sort of throw out what was sort of our notion of sort of organizing, electoral organizing prior to, or at least what I had learned in 2012, which was that we needed to, figure out a way for these communities to become a part of our campaign. I wanted us to instead say, no, we as a campaign need to become a part of these communities. We need to become a part of the fabric of these communities. And, that simple change in thinking, helped a lot in terms of all the tactics and strategies that we developed on an organizing side. There isn't even a long-standing word or translation for the word caucus in Spanish, so it just, going into a lot of communities in the United States and organizing or getting folks to volunteer for a campaign, it is just foreign. What is phone banking? What does that even mean? But instead of sort of getting folks to sort of focus on that, we instead said, how about having the, Hillary Clinton campaign just have a constant presence so that folks in the community care about it, care about our offices, care about our organizers just as much as they care about their neighbor, because their children are, possibly hanging out at the Hillary Clinton campaign office after school and it gives them something productive to do after school, or because, they run into a Hillary Clinton organizer at the local coffee shop, and they have developed a relationship with that organizer because they, attend local community events. And so that was incredibly important in everything we did, keeping in mind that we were focused on this campaign becoming a part of already established communities that were already doing a lot of great work. And it was a part of us, forging a relationship to do work with them. So that was the one first big change. But the second and most important big change was, and because of the nature of it being a caucus, as you mentioned, a competitive caucus, is we focused on delegate count, which is very, very different than, the way that you would approach campaigning or even organizing in a primary, presidential primary, or in a general election campaign. So, a caucus is, not what a traditional election, so to speak, look like. Voters, don't go into a voting booth. They publicly, declare their support for a candidate in a process that's a bit convoluted and complicated. And, ultimately what that means is what matters isn't necessarily raw vote or popular vote. It's the most delegates, which are allocated first on a precinct level. And there are a lot of different rules that sort of dictate how, delegates are allocated to precincts, and how many, delegates a precinct has to award to a specific candidate. But the two biggest things to remember just with regard to a caucus is one, that everywhere matters. And so we invested and we organized everywhere. So whereas in 2012, we may have not put as many resources in the rural communities in Las Vegas, or Nevada rather, in Clark County and in the state, in a caucus, a precinct or a county with 2 voters is just as valuable, if not possibly more valuable, in terms of your investment per delegate, right? Than a precinct that has, or a county that has, 1,500 voters. And so it forced us to organize everywhere, with us, really, really focusing not on looking at numbers and analytics based off of, what you traditionally would if you are, simply trying to win the popular vote in the state. But it forced us to focus it on the delegate count, which had a direct correlation into, our investment, where we invested our resources, who we spent our time with, who the candidate spent her time with, where those communities were, and even the tactics that we actually utilized to organize all throughout the state.
And Hillary also went on to win the Democratic nomination, but then, as we all know, lost to Donald Trump. I'm interested to get your thoughts if there was ever a moment during the general election between Hillary and Trump that you ever conceived that Donald Trump was a legit chance of winning the presidency. Was there ever a moment in the campaign where you had like a bit of a gut check or an experience where you went, oh, that's not a good sign? I asked that question because when we were in Richmond, Virginia, and we had just had coffee or breakfast one morning in a reasonably hipster kind of part of Richmond, Virginia, and went across to some sort of vintage store. I don't think you can get much more hipster than that. And there was a 24...
Sounds like Richmond.
Yeah, it's 25-year-old woman working behind the counter who sounded very progressive. And we sort of, as we were sort of doing a bit of window shopping, we got speaking to her and we asked her, she asked us, what are you over here for? I said, we're just sort of on a bit of a holiday, but also sort of helping out on the Hillary campaign. And she intimated to us that she possibly wasn't going to vote for Hillary because of the emails, and she didn't trust the Clintons. And she said she wasn't going to vote for Trump, but she just wasn't going to come out and vote, whereas she normally would vote. And we sort of walked out of that shop and went, that's not a good sign. And at that time, Virginia was still a battleground state. So, and I know that Hillary ended up winning Virginia, but I ignored that. I still thought Donald Trump was I still thought Hillary was going to win. But was there any moments where you could look back on it and go, didn't see that coming?
Yeah, well, one, was I ever, convinced that Donald Trump could win the election? Absolutely. But at the same time, was I in complete disbelief, maybe even denial the day after Election Day? Absolutely. Man, there are so many moments in the 2016 campaign that sort of were just like gut punches. I think for starters, Donald Trump even running for president was sort of a gut punch, especially being someone who, was a part of the 2012 election and, with President Obama, where there were a lot of rumblings about, Donald Trump running for president in 2012. And I know that he was sort of considering it then, but to actually see him actually do it and to see him go down those elevator, that escalator, and to see, the first comments that he made out of his mouth, calling Mexicans rapists and criminals. And not just to see him do that, but then to also see compared to that sort of just the media's reaction, that sort of let you know that it was going to be something, just because he clearly was sort of a media force, and that was scary in and of itself. So that one, I would say, after him sort of even announcing, it kind of was a little bit of background noise, only because of the fact that we had our own sort of primary to win. And, we every day from day one to the final day, fought like, we had a real opponent, because we did have a real opponent from day one, Senator Sanders. But then, after that, obviously seeing Donald Trump actually win the nomination, that's when I mean, that win or lose, that was for me as a Democrat to see the only other major political party in our country nominate Donald Trump as their nominee. I mean, I don't think your gut gets more, wrenched than that.
So after the loss, what was going through your mind in terms of your commitment to the cause and organising and the work in politics and stuff? Did it make you want to redouble your efforts, or did you just think to yourself you need a bit of a break, or what was your next move?
I didn't think to myself that I needed a little bit of a break. I didn't. I cried for a week, and I was ready to get back up and going. It took me a little bit of time to figure out what exactly getting up and going actually looked like and meant, when there were just, you think about the first, year, but think about the first, 5 months of the Trump presidency. And it was just, there were so many battles to fight, on so many different levels. And, whether you talk about, the Muslim ban, there were just so many different things that could have been, fights to take on, fights that were needed to take on. It took me a while to figure out exactly where I needed to be and could actually, make the biggest difference. And so I spent a little bit of time giving myself some clarity and spending time in California with some great friends, doing a local school board race, which was a lot of fun. And super, super successful. And then just sort of realized after so many communities being attacked from the Trump administration with even that, small period of time, that, it was time for us to figure out a way for us to, one, put them in check, but two, see what we could do even then by that point to start giving ourselves the power to do anything in terms of impeachment. And that led me to, making sure that we could take back the House of Representatives, give Nancy Pelosi back the speaker's gavel, and provide a check in what was, a unified Republican government.
So you went and worked for the DCCC in the lead up to the midterms. Talk us about the organising approach in those midterm elections, and how did it differ from previous campaigns?
Yeah, so in 2018, we ran a organizing program that was much more targeted, I think, but also in terms of one way that it differed from prior campaigns is that, we did persuasion all the way through from day one until the very, very last day of, on election day in a whole host of our districts. The thing about the 2018 midterm elections, so I think those are the two sort of biggest differences. But, the thing about the 2008 midterm elections is that it was the biggest battlefield that the Democrats had ever had, that we were playing in. And, so one thing that traditionally happens at the DCCC, at a committee like the DCCC, is you sort of cast a wide net. You cast a wide net to try and win as many seats as possible, be as competitive in as many congressional districts as possible. And as the cycle progresses, that list sort of narrows, right? And you start to zero in on where your focus should be. Well, the opposite thing happened for us in 2018. The targets actually kept on adding and adding and adding and adding. And so huge battlefield. A lot of opportunity in terms of, the amount of districts that we were playing in to actually get us, the number of seats we needed to win back the nomination. But from an organizing perspective, we built a program that was essentially, we had a motto in our organizing team that sort of permeated, all of our strategy and it was intertwined with all of it. And it was simple. It was, hey, our job is to find our voters and make it easy for them to vote. And what that ultimately led to was a huge investment in vote by mail. So, we were in 2018 a little bit ahead of the curve on what we needed to do in 2020. We invested heavily in vote by mail, in vote by mail programs to get as many of our voters to cast their ballot via that means, just because we know that has a higher percentage of return. It is a much more controlled group for a campaign that you have much longer period of time to sort of deal with and work with that control group. And there are so many different ways that you can actually approach, signing someone up for vote by mail, whether that is in person organizing, whether that is, via paid efforts, via mail, via so many different means. And so we spent a lot of time educating people on vote by mail. We spent a lot of time chasing people to turn in their vote by mail ballots. And in addition to that, taking sort of another step back, we truly did not, aside from sort of vote by mail and that being something that we kind of did everywhere, we didn't really run too much of a national strategy. We ran a committee that was focused on making sure that each of our candidates could run the type of campaign that was needed for their particular district. And that, in some areas looked like Democrats who maybe didn't look like or wouldn't be considered Democrats in other states or in other districts, but was what, those districts needed, and what was needed ultimately for us to get that gavel back.
I have a question for you for later on, but I'm going to ask it now because you mentioned persuasion before. We had Katie Parsons on a couple of times in the lead up to the general election last year, who is from 270. And we were talking about persuasion as a part of the voter contact strategy. And maybe it's not necessarily that you don't necessarily need to use it in a presidential campaign because most people know who are the two candidates at the top of the ticket. But certainly in down ballot races, House of Reps, maybe even Senate, and then state houses, where people don't know the candidate, that persuasion would be an important component of a voter contact strategy, not just registration and turnout. Now, in Australia, voting is compulsory, so we don't worry about turnout. So our conversations in the final 10 to 8 weeks leading up to election day are only persuasion to targeted voters. They're tough conversations, like they're hard conversations to have with likely undecideds or likely persuadable voters. Whereas when you go over to the States and you do voter contact, which is turnout, it's a delight because you're just talking to your own people and you're just saying, hey, have you got a plan? Still important, but it's a completely different kind of experience for the volunteer. What are your thoughts on bringing in a bigger persuasion program into the direct voter contact component of a campaign?
I mean, I think you bring up a really, really great point, which, is always, actually somewhat of a sticking point, for presidential campaigns in America, which is persuasion and to what lengths you do it. I think on one end, you have to realize that a piece of persuasion that, Democrats just oftentimes have to do, it's not education, it's persuasion in terms of, it seems like it's get out to vote, but it truly is persuasion, particularly in 2020 when there was a bit of distrust in the system. There's actual literal persuasion that has to be had there, particularly where we are also convincing folks to cast their ballot, and sometimes in some ways that they traditionally have not in the past. But to go to your point in terms of, investing in it in a much larger way, particularly in presidential campaigns, I think of it less of, of you investing in it in a larger way and more of it, and more so in terms of just investing in it in a different way. Meaning, the reality is you will always probably just have a smaller persuasion universe, particularly by the time you get to whatever point in the campaign where you are also starting to push people out to vote. Also important to note that period of time where you're starting to push people out to vote, at least in America, it is getting earlier and earlier because of early vote. And so you are starting, GOTV much earlier than we have been in prior cycles. But there are a lot of different tactics and tools, particularly if you look at some of the things that we did in 2020, that I think amend themselves towards doing persuasion in a way that that expands your base more so than what typical persuasion actually does. One of the big things that was, a huge part of the 2020 of our organizing in 2020, which isn't new, which is this term of relational organizing, organizing people who you know. It's not new. It's something that is how organizing got started, right? You organize the people who you initially know. But it is putting tools in someone's hand to allow for campaigns to actually capture the data from those relational conversations that people are actually having in their everyday life. And I think that, if anything, is where sort of expanding persuasion programs sort of would live, particularly in a statewide campaign, a presidential campaign, to your point, where there's 100% name recognition for both candidates. And then just from a tactical perspective, that's more effective, particularly for Democratic campaigns, where we just know that for all of the listeners here, you are more likely to listen to someone who you already know, someone who's already a valid source of information for you, and someone who also you have an investment in their well-being, and you like there's someone who you're invested in terms of the outcome of the election. And so, I think it's more so arming your troops with the tools, the tactics, the messaging to talk to their friends and family, to actually allow for more of those folks to start to become a part of your base.
Turning our attention now to the primary season leading into the 2020 general, you jumped on one of the particular races. How does that happen? Does the primary race choose you, or do you choose them? And how did it work for you?
That's a funny question. Man, do the candidates choose you, or do you choose them? I would say, look, if you're lucky, you choose them, but everyone doesn't have that luxury. And I would also add that, again, that luxury is, of luck more than it is of skill or experience. It's important to remember always that this is, an industry, electoral politics, and it is, how many people maintain employment. And so, were there people who worked for their second or third choice candidate in 2020? Absolutely. I know many people who did that. I know people who, just via circumstances on our own campaign, for then Senator Harris, we weren't able to bring on just because of a whole host of reasons, and they may have gone on to work for another candidate. But we were all sort of unified under, this one focus, which was beating Trump. And I think that grounded everyone, regardless of who they worked for. For me, I would like to say that it was a mixture of both. I think that I certainly did not finish the 2018, cycle and 2 years of organizing against Donald Trump and say I absolutely am ready to go back into that area of sort of making a difference. And I finished up that cycle saying, if I do a presidential campaign, which I'm not sure I will only do it for one person, and that's Kamala Harris. And I was in a predicament where I had to make a decision at a certain point of whether I was going to, wait to see if she was going to run for president, or accept other offers that would have, been great in terms of the difference I could have made. But I decided that I wanted Kamala Harris to be president. And so I waited that out, and it ended up working for me. I ended up, talking to friends and folks who I knew were in her orbit. And obviously it just, led what was, the largest field program in the 2018 election cycle. And so luck.
Without sounding like a fanboy, what is the vice president like as a person?
That is such an interesting question. People always ask. I think the best way for me to answer that question, you tell me, what do you think she's like?
Look, I'm glad you asked me that question. I find it hard because I'm so distracted by Maya Rudolph's impersonation of her on SNL. I want her to be like that, just constantly holding a martini glass and there's hair blowing in the wind and just dropping, zingers. But I know she's not like that. I feel that she is a very considered politician. I feel that she is very grounded by her roots and most likely from her mother.
Mm-hmm.
But I think she's very pragmatic and has big ideas, but is realistic about how they can be achieved. And could be quite ruthless in the way that she would approach things. Would be my summary.
I would agree with most of that. I would say that she is many of those things. In addition, I would say that she is, not as sassy as Maya Rudolph, plays. I think I would, switch a lot of that sassiness for more so I mean, she's someone who just is a caring person, someone who is one, determined and focused and certainly goal oriented, and is like, come in a room and, hey, tell me what I need to do so we can like get things going. But at the same time, someone who also is going to care about those people who are in that room and, ask about how they're doing and notice, that someone has a cold and, offer to make them chicken soup or something of the sort. But above all, I think that she is that, and someone who, certainly loves her family, but I think that she is someone who is incredibly focused and determined on the work that's at hand. And that's, what I've seen more than anything.
I know you can't speak for her, but you knowing her well enough and seeing her on the debate stage during the primaries in particular, that I think it was the first or second debate where she really went Joe Biden over busing, I think it was, and it was a seminal moment of that debate. Like that was what all the cameras grabbed. That was their grab from the debate.
Mm-hmm.
It's a unique thing for Australians to watch because we don't have primaries, so therefore we don't normally see candidates verbal each other on national television from the same party. I wonder if she was comfortable with doing such a thing. I mean, would that have been weighing in her mind, going, "I need to stand out here, but how am I going to do that without?" Because it was very strong, but also, geez, it was cutting.
Well, I mean, I think the very reason why, I think that it was not necessarily something that, she would have probably found discomfort in, is the same reason why it was so cutting. It's because it was something that was personal to her. It was an issue that that was very personal to her. And when you're talking about something that has had an impact on you, I think it's a lot easier. I would also say that it was, a subject that that sort of had been talked about prior to, like weeks before, within just like the Democratic primary, was about, the President Biden's, comments regarding, certain senators. And so I don't think it was sort of necessarily too much of a got you moment, because one, like, you don't even know what these folks are going to ask on the debate stage, or what the moderators are going to ask. But it was something that she was probably uniquely comfortable in actually, very, very clearly and in a very strong way pointing out, really comparing and contrasting and providing, which I think a lot of people sort of, don't actually focus on, providing an opportunity, for someone to, honestly absolve to an extent of, some of their past comments, which, were offensive, not just to her, quite frankly, but to an entire community of people, and I would also, like, people don't sort of focus on it, but, Senator Booker also, had some comments about, those comments on the debate stage as well. So I would just say that I think it was comfort in the fact that it was an issue that was deeply personal.
That's interesting. Okay. So then during the primary, she decides that she will need to or have to suspend her campaign. How does one break that news to her staff?
Yeah. Wow. This is so that you are the first person that I've ever talked about, really about sort of this moment. So, I mean, on one hand, I don't think that it certainly is not a decision that's ever taken lightly, and I know Senator Harris and, our campaign and folks on our campaign, it wasn't a decision that was made that day. It was a decision that, was sort of, really a decision that she came to painstakingly, looking at every option and opportunity to continue to go ahead, right? And this was before any votes had been cast, all right? Before, truly saying, hey, this isn't necessarily going to work. But there's also, the reality of, well, I mean, one, like, looking at sort of like not necessarily the writing on the wall, but the options that you have. And in our particular situation, there was an option to continue, right? To continue to fight ahead and let's see what will happen. But also, like, within that predicament, hey, this doesn't work. We're done, and everyone's done, and like everyone's laid off that day. Or we can do this in a respectful way. We're right now in a predicament where we can end this and we can provide all of our staff opportunities to, be paid until the end of the month so that they have some time to actually, find what their next opportunity, their next path is. And so I know that one was a big calculation, which ultimately leads to just like a calculation of money, right? And finances and fundraising and what those prospects are. I found out earlier that morning, I had, my boss called me and told me, hey, it's going to be a tough day and your team's going to need you. And we, had subsequently after that just had a, series of conference calls with the candidate and with our staff prior to the news becoming public. And yeah, I mean, look, it's a tough situation for everyone. It is, not a it is not a decision that, you come to lightly. It is not a situation that anyone wants to come. I think there's, rightfully said, a lot of people say no one ever runs out of reasons to run for president. They typically just run out of money, which is very, very true. And once that decision is made, it's sort of from there a matter of just like taking care of your tribe for a bit and making sure that they, feel loved, feel, like they have done God's work, which they have, even though, your campaign doesn't make it all the way until the end. But also making sure that, that which, for the 2020 Democratic primary where Kamala Harris was the only Black woman, and where we had, our campaign, we had the most diverse staff filled with, people of color, people who have never seen themselves in politics, but saw themselves in Kamala. It was really, really important for, in everyone in leadership to really turn their focus to making sure that those folks stayed involved and stayed engaged and didn't see, the only woman of Black women running for president who, had to, withdraw early as a sort of a means for them to say, hey, this isn't for me, and the work that we want to do isn't something that actually is possible. And they had to still see that, she was still going on, we were still going on, and we expected them to as well.
So following her withdrawal from the race, you were appointed the National Organising Director for Organising Together 2020. What was the purpose of Organising Together 2020 in the lead up to the general?
So Organising Together 2020 it was an organization first of its kind. It was an organization primarily and exclusively focused on building the infrastructure needed for the eventual Democratic nominee in our battleground states. So, the way that, the nominating process sort of works in the United States is that, you don't wrap up your nominating process until, August or July. This time around, our conventions didn't happen until August, which then, really, gives essentially the nominee access to money, that the party's money, that they need to actually utilize to actually start to organize their general election campaign, essentially. Prior to that, they are operating exclusively on what is a different campaign and campaign account. And I mean, thinking about getting an organizing program started in August for, an election cycle where, election day obviously is in November, but also, early voting starts as early as September. It's a recipe for disaster. Organizing is all about getting started as early as you possibly can. And so our focus was getting that started as early as we possibly could, building resources and building something on the ground that we could then hand over to the eventual Democratic nominee, whoever that nominee was. Because at the time when we started this, we didn't know. This was before any votes had been cast as well. This was January of 2020. And we, built up an organization in 6 battleground states, the most, important battleground states that we knew, no matter who the nominee would be important states for them to invest in. And we built program that would allow that program that, was basic enough that it wouldn't be contrary to any type of strategy that a general election nominee actually ended up building. And so we focused on 3 things: on opening offices with organizers in them, recruiting volunteers, and talking to voters and recruiting more volunteers. It was as simple as that. And ultimately, it actually, again, this was all based off of the premise of one, that we can't get our organizing started like wait to get organizing started until August, but also based off of, at that time, the thought, which it certainly looked like, was that it was just also going to be a protracted primary where there was going to be a lot of work to do to sort of just unify our party. Now that necessarily didn't happen in that it wasn't necessarily a protracted primary. I think we all sort of knew that Joe Biden was going to be our nominee, very likely, in March or April. But it still was sort of a protracted, it was protracted in that, Joe Biden just didn't do any organizing until August. And so we sort of served as that stopgate and that to sort of fill that gap while there was no organizing happening on the Democratic side. In addition to that, it allowed for us to really hire organizers who were coming off of other presidential campaigns as they started to withdraw, who would eventually go on to work for the eventual Democratic nominee, really start to build that data, engage volunteers now, and actually start to talk to some voters. And it also, by happenstance, in the midst of this, a pandemic happened, and it allowed for us to spend time that the Biden campaign just didn't have the time to do, just because they were still trying to wrap up a nomination. It allowed for us to figure out, how do you organize in a pandemic? What does that look like? And gave us the space, the time, and the clarity to sort of figure that out.
So that'll lead into my next question, because then eventually once Biden did wrap up the nomination, you joined the Biden-Harris campaign as the National Director for States Organising. It's being over here in Australia, it's hard sometimes to get news sources that are talking about, or articles and commentary that are talking about what is actually happening on the ground from a field perspective. So I hear a lot of speculation and hearsay, and Twitter's full of shit. So what actually was going on the ground? Because there was a lot of reports that there was a reluctance to do canvassing on doors, and that eventually they decided to do that, but quite late in the cycle, and some campaigns didn't do it at all. And there's out of that spun a whole issue about that's why we lost many sort of house races, because it wasn't e-local canvassing, all that kind of stuff. What exactly was going on the ground in terms of the volunteer effort for the Biden campaign in the general?
So I'm glad to clear this up, because there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of folks, saying a whole host of things. So one, just want to clarify that, in a lot of places, actually in most places, our efforts and the efforts for House candidates, there was a difference in that, they ran their campaigns, they ran their efforts. We coordinated with them, certainly, and worked to, lift up all Democrats on the ticket in any given state. But, the congressional campaigns, they run their campaigns via them and the DCCC. And I think it's important to note also that most of them were canvassing throughout from day one, actually, and never actually stopped in terms of the congressional campaigns. Now, what I will say in terms of our strategy on the Biden campaign, from day one, the most important thing was the health and the safety of our staff and volunteers. And so we, each and every day, were monitoring COVID rates and making decisions as best as we could based off of that. Now, within that process, one of the things that we learned and, decided to put our weight on and actually paid off was that, the most important thing outside of everything else, we can talk about door knocking, we can talk about in-person work, we can talk about phone calls. The most important thing is having a meaningful conversation. Simple as that, having a meaningful conversation. And turns out that can be done in person, but it can also be done not in person. And so we did a lot of that. We did a lot of work that was not in person, but we also did work that was in person in a safe way where we could do those things responsibly. And, we developed a strategy based on that. So, we did not do any in-person campaigning, any inter-person activities for a while. When COVID rates were really bad, we were not. But as COVID rates began to drop, we did a few things. So one, we sort of rethought what a field office looked like. And we, opened up instead what were called volunteer action centers, which were not places for volunteers to congregate and, hang out, because COVID did not allow that, but were places for volunteers to come and get resources that they then could take back to their own communities and actually organize with. We allowed for volunteers to canvass in places where it was safe to canvass. In places where it absolutely wasn't, we, allowed for our volunteers to do a mix kind of a canvas where would have them, drop a piece of literature on a door and then, go back to the street and call that person and tell them, hey, I dropped a piece of literature. If they don't answer, leave them, a voicemail. Hey, I was at your home. I dropped a piece of literature to start to build that relationship. And in places where, the COVID rates were where we felt okay, we, provided PPE mask and equipment. We, provided, safety guidelines that were important for us. We, did contact tracing for any person who came in contact with any of our folks, and we allowed for them to do contactless canvassing where it made sense. I think it's also important to note where it made sense. We were not going to just canvass for canvassing's sake. We were going to canvass where it made sense and where those strategies actually mattered. We, in addition to that, we invested in tools that, weren't complicated and allowed for, volunteers to take action in ways that, quite honestly, truthfully, were more compatible to what life was like during COVID or had become like via COVID. People didn't leave to go to work. They didn't have to leave their homes to volunteer either, and we did not, we didn't, necessarily just throw away community with that as well. We utilized tools like Slack to build communities where people could, volunteer and engage in volunteering in, communities of volunteers that were like-minded, in the same way you would actually find it in an in-person environment. We invested heavily in teams that would obviously organize in a traditional way, but also who would organize in those Slack groups and in communities that already exist online that, again, our campaign could go and then be a part of. And, invested a lot in terms of staff. That was really one of the things that looked different from prior cycles. Is just the investment in the amount of staff that we put to allow for us to do some of this quote unquote digital organizing, which is truly just organizing with digital tools in people's hands that allow for them to do it in a way that's remote. And so I think that ultimately the work that we did looked very similar in that we focused on meaningful conversations and having those meaningful conversations. What that translated itself to was us building an organization with tools and with resources that allowed for someone to volunteer remotely and safely, but also us doing work in person where it actually mattered and fit in with our strategy and our tactics. In a safe way, in a way that didn't put any of our volunteers and our staff in any danger, and ultimately in a way that allowed for us to, win, right? But also do that in a way where, 6 of our battleground states came down to field margins. And so I think that we found the right balance. It is not something that is to, necessarily be replicated, but it worked for this moment and this team.
This question is for the Australian organisers listening to the podcast. One of the challenges that organisers in Australia for the Australian Labour Party face is convincing folks of the merits of a strong ground campaign. And it's sort of, I guess this journey kind of began in the 2010, 2013 election cycles at a national level. It has got better, I must admit. But over that journey, we've all received pushback from senior campaigners and politicians inside the party machine, and even some rank and file activists, to be fair as well. I was at a function in 2015 when David Plough, Obama's campaign manager, was out in Australia doing some a book tour or something, I don't know. And I managed to have a conversation with him. And we were talking, he actually asked me about how have you gone in terms of bringing organising into the sort of the main party culture. And I said, actually, it was actually quite difficult. It got branded as that American thing or that Obama thing, and it'll never work here, that kind of stuff. And he laughed because he said that he found that when he was working on the Obama campaign, that he found pushback from traditional Democrats were saying, that'll never work here. And that broke my brain because I just thought it would be, it's fine in the States, but obviously culturally it's different in another country. So I want to get, my question is for you was your organising experience over the last decade facing similar challenges and pushback? How did you deal with it? Or was it a boulevard of green lights all the way through to 2021?
I don't think anything's ever a boulevard of lights, right? Especially not in politics, certainly not in organizing. My experience over the past, decade of organizing, it is certainly hasn't been, a open, easy path, but it has been an evolution. It's been an evolution of things building upon one another, but ultimately sort of focused on, a continuous evolution of sort of meeting people where they are. And that sort of forced more changes within sort of the way that we do things more than anything, healthy changes, good ones. You know, depending on with American politics, depending on the campaign, depends on the veracity of whether organizing is a necessary core tenet, the first thing that you do, or whether it is something that is, secondary, or something that is quite frankly auxiliary. Like maybe we do it, maybe we don't, but like we also maybe we'll vend it out. And you also have this aspect of organizing in American politics where the shiny, bright thing is the thing that people with the money care the most about, which oftentimes isn't the most effective thing. Actually, I would say most of the time isn't the most effective thing. One of the challenges where we have in American politics is, after every election cycle, everything that we've kind of developed a lot, particularly tools, they kind of just get shut down because campaigns are the ones that develop them. There's no long-term sort of sustaining thing that just continues to drive it. But the beauty is that over the past, really since, the election of Donald Trump, quite frankly, we've seen a lot of groups who sort of in a certain way bridge the divides between, the every 4-year presidential cycles, which brings sort of such technological advances in campaigns. Groups like Indivisible, groups like Swing Left, these groups that are doing organizing during off cycles and are continuing with the volunteers that campaigns are using, which then, the best way to continue with those volunteers is quite frankly to just continue with the same technology and tools that those volunteers were already using, or continue to advance on it. We have some work to do there to sort of, perfect that, or, get some of these advances that we, make every 4 years out of the hands of campaigns that rise and fall, and into sort of something that's more so longstanding or a bit more, I hate to say the word, but establishment. And I think, if we get to a place where, a lot of that evolution lives in the hands of folks that are more establishment, the better. But certainly this is a long way of saying it isn't an easy road, but it has been a reflection of, sort of the evolution of where we need to get. It is always harder in midterm elections and, on the off year in American politics, but on the on year, and when you are working sort of on a presidential campaign, you sort of have the resources that no other campaigns have, that you traditionally wouldn't, to sort of, in a lot of ways, revolutionize things for the way that you think that they should go. Do you have pushback, inside your campaign and with the powers that be? Certainly. But outside of that campaign, generally, the movement kind of follows the footprints that big organization has sort of left. So I don't know if that 100% answers the question, but, I think that ultimately, constantly, the best way for it to not be as uphill a battle as it can be is to very, very much respond to, the way that you engage people, which changes honestly every 4 years.
No, look, it really does. And the key word in there is evolution and evolving. And I think that, not every field program would embed that in its culture, but certainly there is a culture here in within the Australian Labour Party of trying to evaluate our most recent campaign, our successes and challenges and key takeaways, and learn from those and evolve. And, a lot of the times, data is such an important component of a campaign in all aspects, but field in particular, because data tells us who we need to speak to. It enables us to analyse the success that we are having in those conversations and analyse, are we hitting our goals? Are we growing our movement? Are we, growing our capacity? So that mix of field and data enables you to make those assessments and work out how you continue to grow and evolve. So we've certainly always embedded that culture, and I think that what our field program looks in 2013 is vastly different to what our field program looks like in going into, say, there might be a federal election this year. I guess where we feel a bit of evolution stress is there are other aspects of the campaign that don't go through that same process, and no one's showing a spotlight on them. It's the same friggin' billboard that goes up every year, and no one's asking the question about what's the return on investment on that. Or it's the same TV ad spots that we're doing each year, which cost millions of dollars, and no one's asking what's the ROI on that. And I think a lot of field organisers sometimes go, why are we always having to justify our work? Those media advisors just sit around and talk shit all day to journalists and try and get lines out for the newspaper that next morning, and that's it. It's been the same strategy that they've been doing for 50 years. Where's their evolution? And I think that's kind of where we get a little bit hot under the collar.
But the beauty is that in organizing, you actually always can provide the proof for pudding. You always can say, hey, this is what we delivered. And again, you look at, this past election cycle, there were a lot of, even prior to it becoming a pandemic, but certainly once there was a pandemic, there was sort of questions rolling around of like, does organizing actually matter? Does it actually matter? Well, the reality is, look, in any election cycle where, in any election where the results are within 3 percentage points, a whole host of things could be the determining factor in terms of taking it out. But certainly if you take field out, you take that 3 percentage points. Again, that could be said for a whole host of aspects for the campaign. But pound for pound, right? You could say how much you invested, how many voters you registered, how many of those folks turned out, how many folks did we engage who are not likely voters, who actually turned out and were likely voters. And it's important, I think for campaigns, but certainly for political parties to spend the time sort of in evaluating that stuff after every election cycle so that there is a reference points for what worked and what didn't. But I think the best way to sort of have that fluidity of sort of evolution is just like the main premise being, hey, our job has to be how do we meet people where they are? And that will force sort of the evolution that is needed, because often also one of the things you don't want to do is provide things that are unnecessary, which often happens in organizing programs. So just throwing tools that are just cool at people just because they're cool. And it's like, hey, well, is that even necessary?
Last question. What is in store for you next?
What's in store for me next? So, as you mentioned, I'm spending some time back on campus with some students at Georgetown, hopefully, imparting a lot of the new way of organize, some of the new ways of organizing that we've learned in 2020 to folks who will be organizers one day, probably very soon, and will really be leading the charge here. After that, we'll see. We have the Democratic Party, we have we have the White House, we have control of the House of Representatives, we have a very, very, very by the skin of our teeth majority in the United States Senate. But we are still going to have some fights on the outside that are needed to make sure that we continue to push our priorities, movement fights on the outside to push our elected officials who we just elected into office to do the things that they said they would do. And, there's still, I think we still have a couple months to see what those fights are going to be as sort of they solidify. This new administration's only been in office for 3 weeks now, not even a full 3 weeks, I don't think. And so we'll see, but I am still going to be organizing, still pushing, the same values that I've been pushing thus far. It is still just to be told where. But right now I'm spending some time with some really, really fun students, and learning a lot from them as well in terms of what worked, and they are playing a big role in us figuring out what's next as well.
Anatole, it was amazing having you on the podcast today. You've had it for such a short period of time. You've had an incredible career, and it started at a very, very early age. And it's kind of bizarre going through this journey with you. I feel like you're 67 now, but you're not. You're still you've got a lot to contribute to the Democratic Party over the next couple of decades. But it's just certainly from an organising standpoint, it's just great to see someone have such energy and passion for the work that they do, and more importantly has been central to bringing about important change in your country. and nothing more greater than getting rid of Donald Trump and bringing in a Democratic administration for the next 4 years and beyond. So, one, congratulations, and two, thank you very much for your time coming on today's podcast.
Thank you. No, thank you. You say I could be 67. I feel like I'm 67. I still have a couple more naps to catch up on from 4 years of organizing and get to Donald Trump. But thank you, and I'm excited about the road ahead. I think there's a lot more work to still be done, and we're going to see some amazing organizing efforts come out of the states that hopefully you guys can learn some from over in Australia.
Indeed.